Picture this with me. It's 2:47 in the morning on a desolate stretch of highway in Castaic, California. A white Chevy Cruze sits alone in the darkness, its engine still warm, its headlights cutting through the September fog like desperate fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. Inside that car sits a 19-year-old college student named Bryce Laspisa. He's been driving for hours. He's been awake for days. His phone has been ringing incessantly, his mother's voice pleading through the speaker, begging him to come home. But Bryce isn't going home. In approximately 1 hour, this car will be found crashed at the bottom of a steep embankment near Castaic Lake. The driver's door will be open. The keys will still be in the ignition. And Bryce Laspisa will be gone. Vanished. As if the earth itself opened up and swallowed him whole. I need you to understand something before we go any further. This is not just another missing person case. This is a labyrinth of contradictions, a puzzle where none of the pieces seem to fit, and a story that will make you question everything you think you know about choice, identity, and the terrifying possibility that someone you love could simply decide to stop existing in your world. Over the next several chapters, I'm going to take you through every twist, every heartbreaking detail, and every unanswered question that has haunted investigators, amateur sleuths, and most importantly, a family for over a decade. But I need something from you first. If you believe that every missing person deserves to be remembered, if you think that someone out there might hold the key to bringing Bryce home, then I need you to share this story. Hit that subscribe button right now because this case needs fresh eyes, and maybe, just maybe, you're the person who will finally connect the dots. This family has been waiting 11 years for answers. Let's give them the attention this case deserves. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand how Bryce Laspisa vanished, you first need to understand who he was before that night. Bryce Daniel Laspisa was born on June 14, 1994, to Michael and Karen Laspisa in Laguna Niguel, California. From his earliest days, Bryce was the kind of kid who seemed destined for greatness, not in a loud, attention-seeking way, but in the quiet manner of someone who possessed both intelligence and genuine kindness. He grew up in a comfortable home, surrounded by love, stability, and every opportunity a parent could hope to provide for their child. His father Michael was successful in business, his mother Karen was devoted and attentive, and by all accounts, Bryce wanted for nothing material. But more than that, he was given something far more valuable. He was given roots. I've studied hundreds of missing person cases over the years, and I've learned that to understand a disappearance, you must first understand what came before it. The happy childhoods, the seemingly normal teenage years, the mundane details that only become significant in retrospect. So bear with me as I paint this portrait, because every brushstroke matters. Bryce attended San Juan Hills High School in San Juan Capistrano, where he wasn't just a student but a standout. He played on the football team with the kind of dedication that earned respect from coaches and teammates alike. He was remembered as funny, sociable, the kind of guy who could walk into a room and make everyone feel at ease. Teachers described him as bright and engaged. Friends remembered his loyalty, his quick wit, and his genuine interest in the people around him. If you had asked anyone who knew Bryce Laspisa to predict his future during those high school years, they would have told you about college success, maybe a career in something that allowed him to use both his athletic ability and his sharp mind. They would have told you about a young man with everything going for him, and they would have been right. At least, that's what the surface showed. In the fall of 2012, Bryce enrolled at Sierra College in Rocklin, California, about a 5-hour drive from his family home. It was a transition that many young people make, that first tentative step away from the nest, the exciting and terrifying leap into independence. For the first year, everything seemed to proceed according to plan. Bryce made friends, adjusted to college life, and maintained his connection with his family through regular phone calls and visits home. He began dating a young woman named Kim, and their relationship quickly became serious. They moved in together during his second year, sharing an apartment near campus. To outside observers, Bryce Laspisa was thriving. But here's what I've learned about the stories we tell ourselves and others. They're often constructed carefully, edited for public consumption, designed to show only what we want the world to see. Beneath the surface of Bryce's seemingly successful transition to adulthood, something was shifting. Something was changing in ways that even those closest to him couldn't fully perceive until it was too late. The first visible cracks appeared in the summer of 2013, during the break between his freshman and sophomore years. Kim, his girlfriend, began noticing changes in Bryce's behavior. He was sleeping more, sometimes for extraordinarily long periods. His typically sharp and engaged demeanor seemed dulled, as if someone had turned down the brightness on his personality. When she mentioned these concerns to Bryce, he dismissed them. When she brought them up with his parents, they attributed the changes to normal college stress, the adjustment period that many young people experience when transitioning to independent life. After all, who doesn't struggle sometimes? Who doesn't have periods where they feel a little off, a little disconnected from themselves? But Kim knew something that would later prove significant, something that would cast every subsequent event in a different light. In the weeks leading up to that fateful September, Bryce had been drinking more heavily than usual. Not in the typical college party way, but in a manner that suggested he was trying to escape something, to numb something, to silence a voice or a feeling that wouldn't leave him alone. She also discovered that he had been abusing Vyvanse, a prescription stimulant commonly used to treat ADHD. The combination of alcohol and stimulants creates a particularly dangerous cocktail, one that can induce paranoia, erratic behavior, and in extreme cases, a complete break from reality. I want you to hold on to this information as we move forward, because it will become crucial to understanding the events that followed. But I also want you to resist the temptation to reduce Bryce's story to simple causation. Yes, substance use played a role, but as you'll see, this case is far more complicated than any single explanation could encompass. August 28, 2013, began like any other day in the life of a college sophomore. Bryce woke up in the apartment he shared with Kim, went through his morning routine, and prepared for another day of classes at Sierra College. The summer heat was beginning to fade, replaced by the subtle shift that signals the transition from one season to another. If there was something different about Bryce that morning, something in his eyes or his manner that might have served as a warning, no one recognized it for what it was. I think about this often when I study missing person cases. The last normal day, that final 24 hours when everything still operates according to the familiar rhythms of daily life. When the people we love are still present and accounted for, when the future still holds all its expected promises. We never know when we're living through a last normal day until it's already gone, until we're looking back through the lens of tragedy and loss, desperately searching for the signs we missed. For Karen Laspisa, August 28th was simply a Thursday. She went about her day in Laguna Niguel, perhaps thinking about her son, but not with any particular urgency. Bryce was doing well at school. He had a girlfriend. He was becoming a man. The natural order of things was progressing as it should. If she felt any maternal anxiety, any unexplainable sense that something was wrong, she likely dismissed it as the ordinary worry that never quite leaves a parent's heart, even when their children are grown. That evening, something happened that would later take on enormous significance. Kim, growing increasingly concerned about Bryce's recent behavior, made a decision. She called Karen Laspisa. The conversation that followed would set in motion a chain of events that none of them could have anticipated. Kim told Karen about the drinking, about the Vyvanse, about the personality changes she'd observed over the past several weeks. She expressed her worry, her confusion, her growing fear that the young man she loved was becoming someone she didn't recognize. Karen listened with the kind of attention that only a mother can give when her child is the subject. And when the call ended, Karen did what any loving parent would do. She called her son. The phone call between Karen and Bryce that night was lengthy and emotional. Bryce admitted to the substance use. He acknowledged that he hadn't been himself. And then he made a promise that, in retrospect, feels like both a beginning and an ending. He told his mother he would drive home that very night. He would come back to Laguna Niguel, back to his family, back to the safety and support that had always been there for him. He would get help. He would get better. He would come home. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Bryce didn't leave immediately. Despite his promise to his mother, despite the urgency in her voice, he waited. Minutes turned into hours. Midnight came and went. And when Bryce finally got into his white Chevy Cruze and started driving south toward home, it was already after midnight on August 29th. What was he doing during those lost hours? What was he thinking? What conversations took place? What decisions were made? What internal struggles played out in the privacy of his own mind? These are questions that have never been answered, gaps in the timeline that have frustrated investigators and tormented his family for more than a decade. All we know for certain is that when Bryce Laspisa finally began his journey home, something had already changed. The straight line from Rockland to Laguna Niguel, a drive that should have taken approximately 5 hours, was about to become something far more circuitous and inexplicable. Let me tell you what should have happened. Bryce should have gotten on Interstate 5 South, the most direct route from Northern California to his family's home in Orange County. He should have driven through the night, perhaps stopping once for gas or coffee, and arrived at his parents' house by early morning. He should have walked through the front door, been embraced by his worried mother, and begun the difficult but necessary process of addressing whatever was troubling him. That's what should have happened. Instead, Bryce Laspisa began a journey that makes no logical sense, a wandering, erratic path that would span almost 2 full days and cover ground that had no connection to his stated destination. And this is where I need to pause and ask you something directly. Have you ever felt so lost, so disconnected from your own life, that the simple act of going home felt impossible? Have you ever stood at a crossroads, knowing exactly where you should go, but feeling utterly incapable of taking that step? I'm asking because I want you to engage with this story on a deeper level. I want you to consider what might drive a person to choose wandering over returning, uncertainty over safety, the unknown over the familiar. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I believe that understanding Bryce's state of mind is crucial to understanding what ultimately happened to him. The hours that followed Bryce's departure from Rockland are among the most confusing and concerning in this entire case. Rather than proceeding directly home, Bryce began what can only be described as an aimless, confused journey through Northern and Central California. He stopped at rest areas. He pulled off at exits that led nowhere particularly significant. He answered some of his mother's frantic phone calls, but not others, providing responses that ranged from reassuring to alarming. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on August 29th, Karen Laspisa received a call that would replay in her memory for years to come. Bryce was stopped at a rest area somewhere along his route. He sounded strange, distant, not like himself. When Karen asked when he would be home, Bryce gave an answer that chilled her to her core. He said he needed to stop and sleep. He said he was too tired to continue. This made a certain amount of sense. He had been awake for many hours, and driving while exhausted is dangerous. But something in his voice, something in the flat effect of his words, told Karen that fatigue wasn't the whole story. The next morning, August 29th, brought no relief. Bryce remained in his car at a rest area near Buttonwillow, California, roughly 3 hours north of his family's home. 3 hours. That's all that separated him from safety, from help, from the parents who were growing more terrified by the minute. But those 3 hours might as well have been 3,000 miles. Throughout the day, Karen and Michael Laspisa took turns calling their son. Sometimes he answered. Sometimes he didn't. When he did pick up, his responses were increasingly troubling. He told them he was fine, that he would be home soon, that they shouldn't worry. But he didn't move. Hour after hour, the GPS on his phone showed him stationary, parked in that rest area as the California sun blazed overhead. Imagine being Karen Laspisa during those hours. Imagine sitting in your comfortable home in Laguna Niguel, phone clutched in your hand, watching the GPS that represented your child remain motionless for hours on end. Imagine the helplessness, the frustration, the slowly mounting terror. She was 5 hours away from her son, but it might as well have been 5 million. She could call him, she could plead with him, she could beg him to just start the car and drive. But she couldn't make him come home. As the day wore on, Karen made a decision born of desperation. She reached out to everyone she could think of who might be able to check on Bryce. Friends who lived in the area. Anyone who might be able to make the drive to that rest area and physically confirm that her son was okay. But distance and circumstance conspired against her. No one was able to reach him in time. By late afternoon, something finally shifted. Bryce began moving again. But instead of heading home, he drove to a friend's house in the area. He spent a few hours there, behavior that would later be described as normal enough, though tinged with an underlying tension. His friend offered him a place to sleep, encouraged him to rest before continuing his journey. But Bryce declined. He got back in his car and continued his strange, meandering journey. What happened next defies easy explanation. Rather than finally pointing his car toward Laguna Niguel, Bryce headed in a direction that made no logical sense given his stated destination. He drove toward Castaic, a small town in Los Angeles County that sits along Interstate 5, but was by no means a necessary stop on the route from Buttonwillow to Orange County. It was as if he was being drawn somewhere, pulled by some invisible force toward a place that would become the last known location where anyone would see Bryce Laspisa alive. Throughout the night of August 29th and into the early morning hours of August 30th, Bryce remained in communication with his parents, though that communication became increasingly strained and strange. At one point, he called his mother and told her he was at a gas station. She could hear the sounds of a convenience store in the background, the beeping of a register, the murmur of other customers. She pleaded with him to tell her exactly where he was, to give her an address, anything that would allow her to send help. But Bryce was evasive, his answers vague and unsatisfying. Karen and Michael were beside themselves. They had been awake for most of 2 days now, their nerves frayed, their fear a living thing that coiled in their chests and made it hard to breathe. They considered driving up to find him themselves, but Bryce's constantly changing location made that nearly impossible. They considered calling the police, but what would they say? Their adult son was driving around California, answering his phone, telling them he was fine. Erratic behavior isn't a crime. Choosing not to come home isn't illegal. The system wasn't designed to help parents whose children were doing something strange, but not demonstrably dangerous. At approximately 1:30 in the morning on August 30th, 2013, Bryce pulled his white Chevy Cruze into a parking area near the on-ramp to Interstate 5 in Castaic. He was now less than an hour from home, close enough that his parents could have reached him in a single desperate drive. But he didn't call them to say he was close. He didn't tell them he was finally almost there. Instead, he did something that no one who knew him could explain. He stopped. He waited. He sat in his car in the darkness of that early morning, and he did not move. At 1:50 in the morning, a California Highway Patrol officer noticed the white Chevy Cruze parked near the on-ramp. In his experience, cars stopped in such locations often meant trouble, a breakdown, a driver who had pulled over to sleep, or occasionally something more concerning. He approached the vehicle and made contact with the driver. Here is where the story takes one of its most heartbreaking turns, a moment that would haunt investigators and the Laspisa family for years to come. The officer spoke with Bryce and found nothing overtly alarming. Bryce was calm. He was coherent. He told the officer he was fine, just taking a break before continuing home. He showed no signs of intoxication, no indicators of a mental health crisis, nothing that would give the officer legal justification to take any action beyond issuing a friendly warning about the dangers of stopping in such a location. The officer told Bryce he needed to move along and then continued on his patrol. It was a reasonable decision based on the information available at the time. There was no way for that officer to know what was happening inside Bryce's mind. There was no way for him to understand that this was not a young man simply taking a break, but a young man teetering on the edge of some precipice that no one could see. And this is where I need to pause and address something directly, something that I know many of you are already thinking about. What if that officer had done something differently? What if he had insisted on calling Bryce's parents? What if he had recognized something in Bryce's eyes, some flicker of distress that would have justified taking him into protective custody? Would Bryce Laspisa still be with his family today? These questions are natural, but they're also dangerous. Hindsight allows us to see patterns that were invisible in the moment. That officer had no crystal ball, no way of knowing that this routine traffic stop would become a crucial moment in one of California's most enduring missing person cases. We cannot judge him for failing to prevent something he couldn't have predicted. After the officer left, Bryce remained in the area for approximately another hour. His phone was still active, and cell tower data would later show that he made several brief calls, including at least one to his mother. The content of that call has never been fully disclosed, but what we know is that it was the last time Karen Laspisa heard her son's voice. At approximately 2:40 in the morning, Bryce began driving again. But instead of getting on the freeway and heading home, he drove in the opposite direction. He headed toward Castaic Lake, a reservoir surrounded by rugged, largely undeveloped terrain. The road wound through hills and past camping areas, eventually reaching a stretch that overlooked a steep embankment dropping down toward the water. At 2:50 in the morning, a highway worker driving past this area saw something that made his blood run cold. A white Chevy Cruze, traveling at what appeared to be a deliberate and controlled speed, drove straight off the road and down the embankment. The worker stopped his vehicle and rushed to the edge, looking down at the car that had come to rest among the brush and rocks approximately 30 feet below. He called 911 immediately. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. They scrambled down the embankment, fully expecting to find a seriously injured or deceased driver inside the vehicle. Instead, they found something that no one could explain. The car was empty. The driver's side door was open. The keys were still in the ignition. There was no sign of Bryce Laspisa anywhere. What followed was one of the most extensive search operations in Los Angeles County history. Within hours of the car being discovered, dozens of personnel from multiple agencies had descended on the Castaic Lake area. Search and rescue teams, both on foot and using all-terrain vehicles, combed through the rugged terrain surrounding the crash site. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the hillsides. Dive teams searched the waters of Castaic Lake itself, a possibility that no one wanted to consider, but that couldn't be ignored. Karen and Michael Laspisa arrived at the scene that morning, having been notified of the crash by authorities. I cannot begin to imagine what that drive must have been like for them. The desperate hope that there had been some mistake, that Bryce was fine, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. And then they arrived, and they saw their son's car at the bottom of that embankment, and they realized that their lives had split into two distinct eras, before August 30th, 2013, and after. The search continued for days, then weeks. Every resource available was deployed. Volunteer search parties joined the professional teams, covering ground that official searchers hadn't been able to reach. Tips came in from all over the country, people who believed they had seen Bryce at a gas station, a bus stop, walking along a highway. Each tip was investigated, but none led to Bryce. As the days turned into weeks, a troubling reality began to set in. Despite the massive search effort, despite the hundreds of hours invested by professional and volunteer searchers alike, there was no sign of Bryce Laspisa. No body was found in the lake or on the surrounding hillsides. No personal effects were discovered beyond what was in the car. No witnesses came forward with reliable sightings. It was as if Bryce had simply ceased to exist the moment his car went over that embankment. The lack of physical evidence led to intense speculation about what might have happened. The most straightforward theory held that Bryce had somehow survived the crash, wandered away from the scene in a disoriented state, and succumbed to the elements somewhere in the rugged terrain surrounding Castaic Lake. This theory was supported by the fact that Bryce had been awake for an extended period and may have been experiencing the effects of substance withdrawal. A confused and disoriented person could have walked into the wilderness and become lost, eventually dying of exposure or dehydration. But there were problems with this theory. The search of the area was exhaustive. Professional teams with trained dogs covered virtually every inch of accessible terrain. If Bryce had wandered off and died within a reasonable distance of the crash, his body should have been found. The fact that it wasn't led some investigators to consider other possibilities. A second theory suggested that Bryce had deliberately staged his disappearance. Proponents of this view pointed to the controlled manner in which the car went over the embankment, the fact that Bryce had been behaving strangely for days before the incident, and the complete absence of any physical evidence of his presence in the area after the crash. If Bryce wanted to disappear, wanted to start a new life somewhere else, crashing his car and walking away under cover of darkness would be one way to accomplish that goal. This theory offered a strange kind of hope to the Laspisa family. If Bryce had chosen to disappear, then he was presumably still alive somewhere. He could, theoretically, change his mind and come home at any time. But it also raised deeply troubling questions. Why would Bryce choose to inflict such pain on his family? What could possibly have driven him to such a drastic action? And if he was out there somewhere, living under a new identity, why hadn't anyone recognized him in the decade plus since his disappearance? A third theory, darker than the others, suggested that Bryce may have encountered foul play. Perhaps he had gotten into a confrontation with someone during his aimless drive through California. Perhaps he had made enemies that his family knew nothing about. Perhaps his erratic behavior in the days before his disappearance was related to involvement with dangerous people. This theory was largely unsupported by evidence, but it couldn't be entirely ruled out. As the search for Bryce's physical whereabouts wound down, the investigation into the circumstances of his disappearance intensified. Detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department interviewed everyone who had contact with Bryce in the days and weeks before August 30th. They reviewed his phone records, his social media activity, his financial transactions. They built a detailed timeline of his movements and tried to understand what had driven him to that embankment in the middle of the night. Kim, Bryce's girlfriend, was interviewed extensively. She cooperated fully with investigators, sharing everything she knew about Bryce's state of mind, his substance use, and their relationship. She expressed her own guilt and confusion, wondering if there was something she could have done differently, some warning signs she had missed. Her pain was obvious and genuine, and investigators found no reason to consider her a suspect. Friends and acquaintances from Sierra College were also interviewed. Most painted a picture of a young man who had been changing, becoming more withdrawn, more distant, less like the Bryce they had known. Some admitted to drinking and using drugs with Bryce, though none reported behavior that seemed to presage what ultimately happened. They were young people grappling with a tragedy they couldn't understand, searching their memories for clues that might explain how their friend had vanished. The investigation also focused heavily on Bryce's online activity in the weeks before his disappearance. His social media accounts were examined for any signs of suicidal ideation or planning for a voluntary disappearance. What investigators found was largely unremarkable. Bryce's online presence showed a typical college student engaged in typical college activities. There were no goodbye messages, no cryptic posts that might have signaled what was coming. Whatever was happening in Bryce's mind, he had not shared it publicly. Financial records told a similar story. Bryce had not withdrawn large amounts of cash or made purchases that suggested planning for a new life. His bank account showed no activity after August 30th. His credit cards remained unused. If Bryce was alive somewhere, he was not using any of the resources that typically allow people to function in modern society. The investigation raised as many questions as it answered. Why had Bryce behaved so erratically in the days before his disappearance? Why hadn't he simply driven home when his parents were so clearly desperate to help him? What was he doing during those long hours when his car remained stationary at rest areas? And most importantly, what had happened in those crucial minutes between when his car went over the embankment and when first responders arrived at the scene? Karen and Michael Laspisa threw themselves into the search for answers. They hired private investigators to supplement the official investigation. They created a website and social media presence dedicated to keeping Bryce's case in the public eye. They appeared on television programs and podcasts, sharing their story and pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Their dedication was tireless, fueled by a parent's love and a refusal to accept that their son was simply gone. But despite their efforts, despite the dedication of investigators and the attention of the true crime community, Bryce Laspisa remained missing. Months turned into years, and years began to accumulate. The active investigation was eventually downgraded, though the case was never closed. Tips continued to come in, but none led anywhere. In the years since Bryce's disappearance, his case has become something of a touchstone in the true crime community. It has been featured on multiple television programs, discussed on countless podcasts, and analyzed in depth on internet forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries. This attention has produced a dizzying array of theories, some plausible, some far-fetched, all attempting to answer the question that has haunted everyone who has examined this case. What happened to Bryce Laspisa? The voluntary disappearance theory remains one of the most discussed possibilities. Proponents argue that Bryce's behavior in the days before August 30th suggests someone who was preparing to leave his life behind. His reluctance to come home, his evasive answers to his parents' questions, his seemingly aimless driving through California. All of these could be interpreted as signs of someone working up the courage to disappear. According to this theory, Bryce drove his car over the embankment to create the appearance of an accident, then walked away to a prearranged meeting point where someone picked him up. From there, he could have gone anywhere, assumed a new identity, and started a completely different life. Supporters of this theory point to cases of other young people who have successfully disappeared, living for years under assumed names before eventually being discovered or choosing to resurface. But this theory has significant weaknesses. There is no evidence that Bryce made any preparations for a new life. He had no hidden bank accounts, no stashed cash, no apparent connections to people who might help him establish a new identity. And while it's true that some people do successfully disappear, it requires a level of planning and resources that doesn't seem consistent with Bryce's erratic behavior in the days before the incident. The suicide theory is another possibility that has been extensively discussed. Bryce had been abusing alcohol and stimulants, a combination known to produce depression, paranoia, and erratic thinking. His strange behavior in the days before his disappearance could be interpreted as signs of a mental health crisis. And driving a car off a cliff is, unfortunately, a method that some people choose to end their lives. But this theory also has problems. The manner in which the car went over the embankment was described by the witness as controlled and deliberate, not the high-speed crash that would typically result in fatal injuries. And if Bryce had intended to kill himself and the crash had somehow failed to accomplish that goal, where did he go afterward? Why was his body never found? Some theorists have suggested that Bryce suffered a mental break, possibly drug-induced, that left him unable to function normally. According to this theory, Bryce may have walked away from the crash in a dissociative state, unable to recognize who he was or remember his life before that moment. He could have wandered until he collapsed in a remote area, or he could have been picked up by someone and ended up living as a homeless or mentally ill person, unrecognizable even to those who knew him. This theory is particularly heartbreaking because it suggests that Bryce might be alive somewhere, unable to find his way home even if he wanted to. There have been cases of people with severe mental illness or amnesia living on the streets for years before being identified. But despite numerous wellness checks and investigations, no one matching Bryce's description has been positively identified. The foul play theory has also garnered attention, though it has the least evidentiary support. Some have suggested that Bryce may have been involved in drug activity that put him in contact with dangerous people. Others have proposed that he might have picked up a hitchhiker or encountered someone with bad intentions during his aimless drive. But there is no evidence that Bryce was involved in any illegal activity beyond personal drug use, and no witnesses have reported seeing him with anyone else during his final hours. As I bring this story to its close, I find myself sitting with the same questions that have haunted the Laspisa family, the investigators, and everyone who has studied this case for over a decade. What happened to Bryce Laspisa on that dark morning in Castaic, California? How could a young man simply vanish into thin air, leaving behind only an empty car and a lifetime of unanswered questions? I don't have the answers. No one does. And I think that's one of the most important things to understand about this case. Despite thousands of hours of investigation, despite the tireless efforts of Bryce's family, despite the attention of the true crime community, we still don't know what happened to this 19-year-old young man. But here's what I do know. I know that Karen and Michael Laspisa have never stopped searching for their son. I know that they wake up every morning with the same hope and the same dread, wondering if today will be the day they finally get answers. I know that they have refused to give up, refused to let their son be forgotten, refused to accept that his story ends on that hillside in Castaic. And I know that somewhere out there, someone has information that could bring them closure. Maybe it's a small thing, a detail that seems insignificant, but could be the key to unlocking this entire mystery. Maybe it's something that someone has been carrying for years, afraid to come forward, unsure if it matters. But I'm telling you right now, it matters. Every piece of information matters. If you know anything about Bryce Laspisa's disappearance, please contact the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. If you think you've seen him anywhere in the world, please report it. This family deserves answers. Bryce deserves to be found. And that brings me back to where I started, to that lonely stretch of highway in the darkness, to a young man sitting in his car with the engine running and his phone ringing. I think about what was going through Bryce's mind in those final known moments. Was he scared? Was he confused? Was he at peace with the decision he had made? I don't know, but I believe that somewhere, somehow, there is an answer. The story of Bryce Laspisa is not just a mystery to be solved. It's a reminder of how quickly life can change, how unexpectedly people we love can slip away, how fragile the connections are that bind us to each other. It's a story about a family's love that has never wavered, about a mother and father who have spent over a decade keeping their son's memory alive. And it's a story that isn't over yet. Because here's what I choose to believe. I choose to believe that Bryce Laspisa is still out there somewhere. Maybe he's living a different life, unable or unwilling to return to the one he left behind. Maybe he's struggling with issues we can't understand, fighting battles we can't see. But as long as his family holds on to hope, as long as people continue to search for answers, as long as his story is remembered and shared, there is still a chance. There is always hope. Even in the darkest moments, even when all evidence seems to point toward tragedy, hope remains. It's what keeps Karen and Michael going. It's what drives the investigators who still work this case. It's what brings people together to search for the missing, to remember the lost, to believe that answers are possible. So I leave you with this. Remember Bryce Laspisa. Share his story. Keep your eyes open. Because somewhere out there, the answer to this mystery is waiting to be found. And maybe, just maybe, you're the one who will find it. If Bryce is out there, if by some miracle he ever sees or hears this, I hope he knows that his family loves him. They've never stopped loving him. They've never stopped searching. And they never will. The door is always open. The light is always on. And home is always waiting. Until next time, keep searching for truth, keep fighting for the missing, and never, ever give up hope.